This is the story of how the largest tank battle ever fought became the largest lie ever told about a tank battle. On the 12th of July, 1943, outside a railway town called Prokhorovka, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps went into action against the 5th Guards Tank Army. The version of that morning you have almost certainly heard involves 1,500 tanks colliding head-on across open ground, 70 Tiger tanks burning on the steppe, and the armored spearhead of the German war machine dying in a single day of fire. Here is what the German quartermaster ledgers actually recorded for the 2nd SS Panzer Corps on the 12th of July, 1943. Permanent tank write-offs for that day came to nothing at all. Not 70 Tigers, and not 400 tanks. According to the Corps Logistics Report itself, no German vehicle was permanently lost. The German historian Karl-Heinz Frieser, working through the Bundesarchiv records, sets the absolute ceiling at 3 vehicles, while Roman Toppel counts 4 Panzer IVs and no Tigers whatsoever. Ben Wheatley, the British historian who examined Luftwaffe aerial photographs taken over that same ground 2 days later, arrives at 5. Across the field from them, the 5th Guards Tank Army lost somewhere between 235 and 340 armored vehicles before lunch. What follows covers Operation Citadel, the Kursk salient, Zhukov's deliberate gamble, and Hitler's cancelled offensive. Along the way it takes in the catastrophic combat debut of the Panther tank, a Soviet tank army that drove itself into a ditch its own engineers had dug, and a general who invented a victory to avoid a firing squad. It also explains why the real turning point of the summer of 1943 was never the battle everyone remembers, but the 2 offensives almost nobody talks about. To understand Kursk, start with the shape of the ground, because the shape of the ground created the battle. On the 2nd of February, 1943, the German 6th Army surrendered at Stalingrad, and the Red Army pushed west through the collapsing German southern wing. Soviet forces retook the city of Kursk on the 8th of February, then Rostov fell 6 days later on the 14th. To German eyes, the entire southern front looked like it was coming apart. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein received what the German army called operational freedom, and Manstein spent it on one of the most closely studied counterstrokes of the war. German doctrine had a name for the maneuver Manstein selected, the backhand blow, Schlagen aus der Nachhand. Rather than meeting the Soviet advance head-on, Manstein let the Red Army overextend, then struck the exhausted spearheads from the flank. From the 21st of February, Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army drove into that Soviet advance, and the Third Battle of Kharkov followed. Kharkov itself changed hands on the 15th of March. Belgorod fell to the Germans 3 days after that, on the 18th of March, 1943. And that's when the ground melted. The spring Rasputitsa, the season of mud that turns Russian and Ukrainian roads into liquid clay twice a year, brought operations to a stop by the middle of March. When the front froze into place, it left behind a piece of geography that would decide the next 5 months. The Red Army still held a bulge of territory pushing west into the German line, running roughly 250 kilometers from north to south and roughly 160 kilometers from east to west, with the city of Kursk sitting at its center. On a map, the Kursk salient resembled an invitation. It looked like a fist thrust into a doorway, waiting for the door to slam. Every German officer who studied that map saw the same thing, which was precisely the problem, because every Soviet officer studying the same map saw it too. Manstein presented a plan on the 10th of March, 1943, and the concept was simple in the way that all pincer operations are simple. 2 German attacks, one from the northern face of the salient and one from the south, driving toward each other to meet behind Kursk and cut off everything trapped inside. On the 15th of April, 1943, Adolf Hitler issued Operational Order No. 6. That operation carried a name, Zitadel, meaning citadel. Operational Order No. 6 declared that the coming victory must have the effect of a beacon seen around the world. That line deserves a caution, because it shows how carefully this whole story has to be handled. The far more famous phrase attached to Kursk in 100 documentaries promises that the whole world would hold its breath. That phrasing is genuinely Hitler's, and it is genuinely documented, preserved in the Nuremberg record as document 872-PS, but it belongs to Operation Barbarossa in 1941. When you hear it attached to Kursk, what you are hearing is 2 years of retelling collapsing into one quotable sentence. The beacon line is the one that belongs to Citadel. Citadel was originally meant for early May, yet it did not launch in early May, and it did not launch in June either. The offensive slipped again and again, and the reason behind those postponements ranks among the most consequential decisions of the war, because Hitler was waiting for machines. Specifically, Hitler was waiting for the Tiger, the Panther, and the Ferdinand. Heinz Guderian had become Inspector General of Panzer Troops in February of 1943, and his entire assignment involved rebuilding German armored strength after the catastrophe on the Volga. Guderian understood exactly what Citadel would cost that rebuilt force, and Guderian opposed the operation. Others opposed it too. The exchange between Guderian and Hitler on the 14th of May ranks among the most quoted in the entire literature of the Eastern Front. Hitler admitted that whenever he thought about this attack, his stomach turned over. Guderian replied that in that case, the Führer's reaction to the problem was the correct one. That exchange reaches us through Guderian's memoir, Panzerleader, and that fact deserves a moment of attention. Memoirs written by German generals after 1945 share a consistent tendency, in which the generals were always right and the political leadership was always wrong. Historians widely accept the stomach quotation, but it comes through a filter, and this filter will keep returning, because at Kursk the memoir problem eventually becomes the entire story. Guderian also put a more practical question to Field Marshal Keitel, asking how many people Keitel imagined even knew where Kursk was. By the summer of 1943, the answer involved the Soviet General Staff, in extraordinary detail. On the 8th of April, 1943, Georgy Zhukov sent Joseph Stalin a memorandum, and that document belongs among the handful of pages that steered the Second World War. Zhukov's recommendation ran against everything the Red Army had spent 2 years learning to want, because Zhukov proposed that the Soviet Union should not attack. Instead, the Red Army would deliberately hand the initiative to the Wehrmacht, absorb the German offensive on prepared ground, let the German armored force exhaust itself against fortifications, and only then counterattack. Stalin, advised also by Alexander Vasilevsky, the chief of the General Staff, agreed. Consider how unusual that choice was. The Soviet High Command in 1943 had never been an institution that enjoyed waiting. At Kursk, though, the Stavka gave up the initiative on purpose, in advance, in writing, fully expecting to absorb the heaviest blow the German army could still throw. That single decision explains why almost every popular account of Kursk runs backwards. The story usually arrives as though the Germans attacked and the Soviets desperately held on. What actually happened is that the Soviets designed a battle, invited the Germans into it, and the Germans accepted the invitation. The command structure, built to fight the battle, was layered like the defenses themselves. Konstantin Rokossovsky commanded the Central Front, holding the northern face of the salient, while Nikolai Vatutin commanded the Voronezh Front on the southern face. Behind both of them, out of contact and out of German sight, Ivan Konyev commanded the Steppe Front, the strategic reserve. The Steppe Front functions as the quiet protagonist of this entire story, because German intelligence never properly accounted for it. Remember that formation. What the Red Army built inside the Kursk salient between April and July of 1943 was not a defensive line but a defensive system, engineered in depth, and the numbers deserve stating precisely, because the numbers explain why Citadel failed. Ben Wheatley summarizes the construction this way. The Soviets built 8 staggered defense lines reaching a total depth of 300 kilometers once the Steppe Front's positions are included, which comes to 186 miles of layered fortification. Voronezh Front and Central Front together laid 503,663 anti-tank mines, alongside 439,348 anti-personnel mines. In the sectors the Soviet command judged most important, density climbed to 1,500 anti-tank mines and 1,700 anti-personnel mines per kilometer of front. Dennis Showalter puts that density into proportion. It ran roughly 4 times the mine density at Stalingrad, and roughly 6 times the density outside Moscow. The Voronezh Front alone installed 83,912 gun and machine gun emplacements, 5,322 command and observation posts, 17,505 shelters and earth bunkers, and 593 kilometers of wire obstacles. Excavation figures on that scale are close to impossible to picture. Voronezh Front dug roughly 4,200 kilometers of trench, while Central Front dug roughly 5,000. Showalter's summary figure for the whole salient reaches roughly 3,000 miles of trenches, cut using the entire civilian population of the region, with more than 300,000 civilians digging, hauling, and laying mines under military direction. There is a term for what the Red Army built at Kursk, and it did not come out of any army. It came out of computer science. Modern network security architecture rests on a principle called defense in depth, and the core insight behind defense in depth holds that a single perimeter always fails. Firewalls get breached, credentials get stolen, and the perimeter never amounts to the defense. So instead of building one wall, security architects build layers, each designed to slow an intruder, log the intrusion, and force the attacker to burn time and resources penetrating the next layer, until the cost of the attack exceeds whatever the attack was worth. That description fits the Kursk salient exactly. 8 belts of it, reaching 300 kilometers deep. Anti-tank strongpoints, the PAK fronts, sited not to stop the German armored wedge but to channel it into prepared killing zones. Minefields laid not to prove impassable but to prove expensive, forcing engineers forward under artillery fire and wrecking the German timetable. The Soviets were never trying to halt the Wehrmacht at the perimeter. Instead, the Soviets intended to make the Wehrmacht pay for every kilometer until the offensive ran out of money. That mine density figure carries one further layer of that same analogy. A minefield laid at 1500 mines per kilometer functions less as a barrier than as a detection system, and German units frequently discovered a minefield the way a modern network administrator discovers an intrusion, which is to say that something exploded. Before the fighting begins, the ledger deserves attention, and this is where the first hard lesson of Kursk research applies, because nearly every number attached to this battle exists in at least 2 competing versions, and the gap between those versions is itself the story. The German force assembled for Citadel usually appears as 780,900 men, with 2,928 tanks and assault guns, and 9,966 guns and mortars. Those figures come through the tables used by David Glantz and Jonathan House. Nicholas Zetterling and Anders Frankson, working directly from German archival records for their statistical study, give roughly 780,000 men, somewhere between 2,450 and 2,500 tanks and self-propelled guns, and roughly 1,800 aircraft. Zetterling and Frankson also make a point that reshapes everything downstream, which is that Soviet-era sources routinely inflated German strength to around 900,000 men, 2,700 to 3,200 tanks, and 2,800 aircraft. Karl-Heinz Frieser, writing the German official history, narrows the comparison further, counting roughly 518,000 German frontline troops against 1,426,352 Soviet combat troops. The Soviet total, drawn from the Krivoshev data, comes to 1,910,361 men, 5,128 tanks, 25,013 guns and mortars, and somewhere between 2,792 and 3,549 aircraft. Set those 2 columns beside each other and the arithmetic of Citadel becomes visible before anyone fires a shot. The Red Army held more than twice the manpower, nearly twice the armor, and 2.5 times the artillery, while sitting inside 300 kilometers of fortifications it had spent 3 months building, in a place it had chosen, waiting for an attack it fully expected. On the German side of the salient, the command structure divided at the waist. Walter Model's 9th Army held the north under Gunther von Kluge's Army Group Center, while Hermann Hoth's 4th Panzer Army and Army Detachment Kampf under Werner Kampf held the south, both under Manstein's Army Group South. The southern spearhead belonged to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, commanded by Paul Hauser, with 3 divisions. Leibstandard under Theodor Wisch, Das Reich under Walter Kruger, and later Heinz Voll, Totenkopf under Hermann Priess. Those 3 divisions would meet the 5th Guards Tank Army at Prokhorovka, so hold their names. Citadel slipped by months so that 3 vehicles could arrive, and examining what those 3 vehicles actually accomplished offers the fastest route into why the offensive failed. Start with the Tiger, since the Tiger dominates the mythology of this battle more thoroughly than any other machine. According to the Tank Museum, 146 Tiger tanks were committed to Kursk across the entire battle, out of a German armored force numbering somewhere between 2,400 and 2,900 vehicles. In the Tank Museum's own phrasing, the Tiger amounted to a very small proportion of overall German tank strength. That number matters enormously, and it will matter far more shortly, because the traditional account of a single day at Prokhorovka claims that 70 Tigers were destroyed there. 70 Tigers lost in one morning, out of 146 committed to a 5-week battle. Now the Panther, whose story teaches more than either of the others. The Panzer V Panther made its combat debut at Kursk, with roughly 200 issued to Panther Regiment von Lochert, commanded by Meinrad von Lochert, comprising Panzer Battalions 51 and 52, attached to the 48th Panzer Corps of Hoth's 4th Panzer Army. Counting command tanks, the figure usually appears as 204. 2 Panthers burned out from engine fires while unloading from the trains. That happened before the battle, while the vehicles were still coming off the railcars. By the 5th of July, the opening day, only about 184 Panthers remained operational. Within 2 days that number collapsed to roughly 40, and by the 10th of July, 5 days into the offensive, 10 Panthers out of 200 could still move and fight. The report filed on the 20th of July lays out the breakdown with brutal clarity. 41 still operational, 85 reparable in the field, 16 requiring depot repair back in Germany, 56 burned out by enemy action, and 2 destroyed by their own motor fires. Read those categories again, because 56 Panthers were killed by the Red Army while roughly 100 more sat out of action for reasons that had nothing to do with the enemy. By the 11th of August, total Panther write-offs reached 156, with 9 still running. Anyone who has worked in modern product development recognizes what happened to the Panther at Kursk, because some version of it happens somewhere in the technology industry every quarter. The Panther shipped before it was finished. Engine fires, gearbox failures, and transmission losses under load are not combat vulnerabilities. They are the failure signatures of a product rushed through validation to hit a launch date. The detail that makes the comparison exact is what happened to the schedule. Citadel slipped by months, at enormous strategic cost, specifically to wait for the Panther. A launch date moved for the product, the whole campaign waited, and the product still arrived broken, with 2 units catching fire before anyone unloaded them. German High Command paid for that delay twice over. Once in the months of warning handed to the Red Army, which spent every one of those weeks digging. And once again when the machine those months had bought lost more of itself to its own engines than to Soviet gunfire. Then there is the Ferdinand. Between 89 and 90 Ferdinands, formally designated the Sonderkraftfahrzeug 184, went into action at Kursk, organized within Heavy Panzerjäger Regiment 656 alongside Heavy Panzerjäger Battalions 653 and 654. All of them fought in the north under model. The Ferdinand carried an 88mm Pak 43L71, ranking among the most powerful anti-tank guns of the war. In its original configuration, the Ferdinand carried no hull machine gun at all. Picture a 70-ton vehicle mounting a gun capable of killing anything on the battlefield, with no way to defend itself against one man holding a satchel charge at 10 meters. Guderian compared the use of Ferdinands against infantry to shooting quail with a cannon. The popular version of what followed has Soviet infantry swarming the helpless Ferdinands with Molotov cocktails, and historians push back hard on the romance of that image. Battalion 653 claimed 320 Soviet tanks destroyed against the loss of 13 Ferdinands across the Kursk period, which is not the record of a helpless vehicle. Within 4 days, though, nearly half the Ferdinand force sat out of service, and the primary causes were mines and mechanical failure. Mines and mechanical failure. Not heroism, and not swarming infantry, but engineering and arithmetic. Soviet foreknowledge of Citadel ranks among the most dramatic intelligence stories of the war, and it also ranks among the most overstated, which means it deserves both halves of the treatment. The Soviet Union received warning of the German summer offensive through several channels. One ran through the Lucy Ring, operating out of Switzerland around Rudolf Rössler in Lucerne and connected to Alexander Rado's network in Geneva. Another, far better documented, ran through John Cairncross. Cairncross worked at Bletchley Park, the British code-breaking establishment, and passed raw ultra-decrypts to Soviet intelligence. Christopher Andrew and Vasily Mitrokhin described the consequence in the Mitrokhin archive, writing that the Luftwaffe decrypts Cairncross provided mattered enormously in allowing the Soviet Air Force to launch massive preemptive strikes against German airfields, destroying over 500 enemy aircraft. The material Cairncross passed in February of 1943 reportedly detailed the full plan of the Wehrmacht's summer offensive along a 1,200-kilometer front, and Cairncross received the Order of the Red Banner for it. Anastas Mikoyan recorded Stalin warning of an attack in the Kursk sector as early as the 27th of March, 1943. Now for the correction, because this is where the spy story usually swallows the military one. Historians dispute how decisive any of that espionage actually proved, for a simple reason. The German build-up around the Kursk salient consumed 3 months, involving 3 months of rail movements, 3 months of armored concentrations, and 3 months of engineer work, all arranged in a shape that pointed at exactly one place on the map. Guderian's own question about who even knew where Kursk was got answered by the shape of the German army itself. The intelligence sharpened the timing and confirmed intentions. It did not create the Soviet defense, because the defense responded to geography any competent staff officer could read. Philip Knightley has also disputed whether Ultra ever served as the true source of the Lucy Rings material. There is a German half to the intelligence story as well, and it carries far more weight than the Soviet half. Reinhard Gehlen ran Fremdherost, German military intelligence for the Eastern Front, and Fremdherost badly underestimated Soviet operational reserves. Gillen's organization specifically failed to account for Konev's steppe front. That is the intelligence failure that decided Citadel. Not what Stalin knew, but what Hitler did not. German preliminary attacks opened on the 4th of July, 1943, in the south, aimed at seizing jumping-off positions. The main assault came at around 4 in the morning on the 5th of July, though it did not open the way the German plan intended, because as German units moved into their final assault positions, Soviet artillery fired first. That Soviet counter-preparation, a preemptive bombardment dropped onto German assembly areas before the German attack could start, demonstrates as clearly as anything could that the Red Army knew not only where the blow was coming but roughly when. In the air, the 5th of July produced one of the largest air battles in history and one of the costliest single days in the history of aerial warfare. The Soviet Air Force attempted a preemptive strike against German airfields, German radar detected the incoming formations, and the strike was largely intercepted before it arrived. That detail deserves a moment. The Soviet preemptive airstrike grew directly out of the Cairncross intelligence, and it was detected by radar and broken up in the air. Both the intelligence coup and the operational failure belonged to the same morning. On the ground, Model in the north and Hoth in the south attacked in fundamentally different ways, and the gap between those two approaches reveals one of the more interesting arguments running inside the German army. Model led with infantry and held his armour back, intending to preserve the panzer divisions for exploitation once the infantry had chewed through the crust. Hoth did the opposite, concentrating a massed armoured wedge, the Panzerkeil, and driving it straight into the Soviet defensive belts. Both approaches ran into 8 belts of defenses, 300 kilometers deep, roughly 500,000 anti-tank mines, and artillery that had already registered every meter of ground. Model's 9th Army attacked in the north into the sector held by Rokossovsky's Central Front, and by Nikolai Pukhov's 13th Army in particular. Two place names define the northern battle, Panirai and Alkavatka. German forces in the north never produced a breakthrough. What it produced was penetration, measured in single kilometers per day, into successive belts designed specifically to make that rate impossible to improve. German mine-clearing problems repeatedly stalled the advance and left columns sitting still under registered artillery fire. This is where the 89 Ferdinands fought, and where nearly half of them broke down or struck mines inside 4 days. Model's 9th Army was finished as an offensive force within a week, in strategic terms, though formal recognition of that fact would take longer to arrive. There was also a vulnerability in Model's northern position that almost nobody watching the battlefield at Kursk was thinking about, because it lay behind him, inside the Oral salient. Hold that thought as well, because it arrives on the 12th of July. The southern attack went better, and that is the reason the Kursk argument has never fully ended, because in the south the Germans genuinely advanced. Hoth's 4th Panzer Army broke into the Voronezh front's defenses through Cherkaskoy, pushed on through Sertsevo, and drove toward Aboyan. Vatutin fed Mikhail Katakov's 1st Tank Army and Ivan Chistyakov's 6th Guards Army into the defensive battle. By the second week of July, Hoth had made the decision that would produce the most famous engagement of the war. Rather than continuing to batter north toward Aboyan along the axis the Soviets most expected, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps under Hauser turned northeast, toward the rail junction at Prokhorovka. Vatutin asked the Stavka for reserves, and the Stavka released Pavel Rotmistrov's 5th Guards Tank Army out of Konev's steppe front. Those reserves belonged to the steppe front, the formation that Gehlen's Fremdherost had failed to count. On the 11th of July, 1943, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps held ground around the Oktyabrski State Farm and Hill 252.2, southwest of Prokhorovka, with the Sel River on their left flank. The 5th Guards Tank Army moved into assembly positions to attack them at dawn. Now comes the 12th of July, 1943, and the single most misrepresented day of the Second World War. Take the forces in order, and take them from the archival record. On the evening of the 11th of July, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had 294 tanks and assault guns operational, a figure that comes from Zetterling and Frankson's archival work and has since been adopted by Frieser, by Toppel, and by Wheatley. 294, broken down by division as follows. Leibstandard fielded 77, Das Reich fielded 95, and Totenkopf fielded 122. Of those 294 vehicles, 15 were Tigers, and the distribution of those 15 matters more than the total. 10 of them served with Totenkopf, operating north of the Sel River, away from the main Soviet assault. 4 served with Leibstandard. 1 served with Das Reich. which meant that in the Leibstandart sector, the sector absorbing the main weight of the Soviet attack on the morning of the 12th of July, roughly 4 Tiger tanks were present. For Tiger tanks, in the one place where the fighting actually happened. No Panthers fought at Prokhorovka, since the Panthers were elsewhere at Kursk with the 48th Panzer Corps breaking down. No Ferdinands fought at Prokhorovka either, since the Ferdinands sat 200 kilometers north with Model. Sean McMeekin, in Stalin's War, offers a related count. By the time Hauser's 2nd SS Panzer Corps engaged at Prokhorovka, McMeekin writes, the 3 armored divisions contained all of 211 operational tanks, of which only 15 were Tigers and none were Panthers. McMeekin's 211 counts battle tanks while excluding assault guns, which is why it sits below the 294 figure. Both numbers describe the same force, and neither number comes anywhere near 700. Across the field, Rotmistrov's 5th Guards tank army as a whole fielded roughly 793 tanks plus somewhere between 37 and 57 self-propelled guns, adding up to approximately 840 armored vehicles, according to Zetterling and Frankson. The number actually committed against the 2nd SS Panzer Corps in the Corps sector appears as roughly 616 in Zetterling and Frankson, or roughly 500 in Glantz and Haus, who break it into 430 in the first echelon and 70 in the second. Within that total, the 18th Tank Corps contributed around 190 armored vehicles, while the 29th Tank Corps contributed around 212. So here is the actual arithmetic of the largest tank battle in history, on its most famous day. Roughly 294 German vehicles, roughly 500 to 616 Soviet vehicles in the Corps engagement. A total falling somewhere between 800 and 910 armored vehicles. The popular figure is 1,500, while the Prokhorovka memorial uses roughly 1,200. Archival records support neither one. What decided the morning of the 12th of July was never a duel between Tigers and T-34s. It was a piece of Soviet engineering. At the base of Hill 252.2, in front of the Oktyabrski State Farm, ran an anti-tank ditch roughly 4.5 meters deep, dug by Soviet engineers as part of the Soviet defensive system months earlier. Rotmistrov's tanks attacked downhill, at speed, into their own obstacle. Some tanks dropped straight into the ditch, while others funneled toward a captured crossing point, compressing the assault into a narrow lane and exposing their flanks at close range to German anti-tank fire and dug-in armor. Valery Zamulin, the Russian historian who served as research director at the Prokhorovka Museum, describes it plainly. Zamulin writes that it remains incomprehensible why the Soviet brigade and battalion commanders did not know about this barrier or about the crossing, and that the SS then began to finish off the shock wedge of Rotmistrov's tank army with artillery and tank fire. Read that sentence again and note who wrote it. Not a German apologist, and not a Western revisionist, but the former research director of the Prokhorovka Museum itself. The losses on the 12th of July, drawn from every available source, run as follows. Soviet vehicles written off permanently, approximately 144 in the United States Army Combat Studies Institute figure, 207 in the Soviet records, 235 in the work of Frieser and Wheatley, and 255 in Wheatley's alternate count. Soviet vehicles damaged and destroyed together, roughly 300 in the Koltunov and Soloviev figure, 340 in Zamulin's, and 400 for the whole army in Glantz and Haus. German permanent write-offs on the 12th of July, none at all, according to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps logistics report. A maximum of 3 according to Frieser, being 2 Panzer IVs and 1 Tiger. For according to Toppel, being 4 Panzer IVs belonging to the 6th Company of the SS Panzer Regiment of Leibstandart, with no Tigers at all. 5 according to Wheatley, being 4 Panzer IVs and 1 Tiger. Damaged but recovered adds roughly 60 to 80 German vehicles per Glantz and Haus, and that distinction sits at the crux of the entire loss accounting problem. A damaged tank recovered from ground you still hold goes back into the line. A damaged tank abandoned on ground the enemy holds is gone forever. The Germans held the Prokhorovka battlefield after the 12th of July, and that single fact converts a large number of German damaged vehicles into repairs, while converting a large number of Soviet damaged vehicles into total losses. Zetterling and Frankson extend the accounting across the whole period, finding that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps permanently lost 17 armored vehicles across the entire span from the 12th to the 23rd of July. 17 vehicles in 12 days, for a formation that was supposedly destroyed. Everything laid out so far raises an obvious problem. If the German records are that clear, the 70 destroyed Tigers had to come from somewhere. The answer is that the myth of Prokhorovka never happened by accident of translation or drift of retelling. That myth was manufactured, deliberately, by a man who needed it, within days of the battle. Pavel Rotmistrov had taken the 5th Guards Tank Army, a fresh formation newly replenished, into a single morning's action and lost a large fraction of it. Stalin found out. The Russian historian Alexei Isayev described the reaction in a 2018 account. Stalin was extremely disappointed with the loss of more than half of the vehicles that a tank army fresh from replenishment had incurred over just 10 hours, and Stalin put Georgy Malenkov, secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee, at the head of a special commission to investigate. Rotmistrov faced a possible tribunal, and Rotmistrov was reportedly saved by Vasilevsky's intercession. What Rotmistrov produced for that commission, and then for history, was a number. The 5th Guards Tank Army's own report of the 17th of July claimed 298 German tanks destroyed, including 55 Tigers, covering the 12th through the 16th of July, while acknowledging its own irrecoverable losses at 334 armored vehicles. That breakdown deserves stating in full, because it is the most honest thing in the document. 222 T-34s, 89 T-70s, 12 Churchills, 8 Su-122s, and 3 Su-76s, plus a further 212 vehicles under repair. Then, in his 1960 memoir, Rotmistrov raised the German figure to 400 tanks destroyed at Prokhorovka, including 70 Tigers. 70 Tigers, out of 146 committed to the entire Battle of Kursk, out of 15 present at Prokhorovka, out of 4 in the sector where the fighting actually happened. The claim is not an exaggeration but an invention, and it was an invention with a purpose, produced by a commander under investigation who needed the losses of the 5th Guards Tank Army to look like the price of a great victory rather than the result of driving into a ditch. From Rotmistrov's memoir the number entered the Soviet official narrative, and from the Soviet official narrative it entered Western popular history. John Ericsson's formulation, quoted by John Keegan, describes more than 300 German tanks lying wrecked on the steppe, among them 70 Tigers. The inflation did not stop at Prokhorovka either. Freezer's work on the campaign-wide figures finds that the Soviet claim of 3,572 German tanks and assault guns lost across the entire Kursk campaign corresponds to an actual figure of 252, of which 10 were Tigers. 3,572 claimed against 252 actual. That is not a margin of error, that is a factor of 14. The method historians use to dismantle the Prokhorovka myth is not really a historical method at all. It is an auditing method, and understanding how it works explains why the revision has held. When a forensic accountant investigates suspected fraud, the technique never involves arguing with the company's claims. The technique involves tying every claim back to a source document. Not the sales report, but the invoices. Not the summary, but the ledger. Zetterling and Frankson, Freezer, and Wheatley did exactly that with tanks. Instead of accepting claimed kills, which amount to the equivalent of a company's self-reported revenue, they went to the German quartermaster war diaries, the armored inventory returns filed on the 20th of July and the 1st of August, 1943, and the vehicle strength reports every division was obligated to submit. A tank a division still owns appears on the next inventory, while a tank written off does not, which makes the reconciliation mechanical. Then Wheatley added the physical evidence. German reconnaissance aircraft photographed the Prokhorovka battlefield on the 14th, 15th, and 16th of July, 1943, while German forces still held the ground, and those photographs sit today in the United States National Archives. Wheatley analyzed them, counted wrecks, and found exactly what the ledgers had predicted, which was a field of destroyed Soviet armor. Dated photographs of the inventory. Signed returns from the custodian. Claims that fail to reconcile against either one. That procedure established the difference between 298 claimed German kills and roughly 4 documented write-offs, and it is the same procedure by which an auditor catches revenue that was booked but never earned. On the 13th of July, 1943, Hitler summoned Kluge and Manstein to the Wolfschanz and announced that Citadel was being halted. The standard explanation, repeated across most accounts and asserted vigorously by Manstein himself, points to Sicily. Allied forces had landed in Sicily on the 10th of July, 3 days earlier, and the traditional narrative holds that Hitler stopped the offensive to release forces for Italy. That explanation is now seriously disputed, and the dispute forms one of the strongest contrarian positions in modern Kursk scholarship. Roman Topol argues that the decisive operational cause lay not in the Mediterranean but in something that happened on the 12th of July, on the same day as Prokhorovka, 400 kilometers to the north. That offensive was Operation Kutuzov. While Rotmistrov's tanks were driving into an anti-tank ditch outside Prokhorovka, the Red Army launched a full offensive against the German-held Oral salient, directly threatening the rear of Model's Ninth Army. The northern pincer of Citadel had not merely stalled, because the northern pincer was now under attack from behind. Topple's argument holds that this, rather than Sicily, forced the halt. The Channel military history visualized publicly adopted Topple's position and retracted its earlier claim about the Sicily explanation. Further evidence comes from the movement of the units themselves. Had Sicily driven the decision, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps should have gone to Italy. Leibstandard did go. Das Reich and Totenkopf did not, both being sent instead to the Meuse front between the 30th of July and the 2nd of August. 2 of the 3 divisions supposedly pulled out of Kursk to save Italy went to another part of the Eastern Front. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps withdrew from the Prokhorovka area on the night of the 17th into the 18th, and the 18th into the 19th of July. Erich von Manstein published Lost Victories, Ver-Lorraine Siege, in 1955, and that book has shaped English-language understanding of Kursk more powerfully than any archive. Manstein's claim holds that on the 13th of July, when the battle stood at its climax and the issue lay apparently within reach, Hitler robbed him of a victory available in the south. It is a compelling claim, and in the assessment of Frieser, Topple, and Glantz, it is also wrong. The rebuttal rests on 3 points. First, the steppe front reserves remained largely uncommitted, since Konev still held forces that had never entered the battle. Any German breakthrough in the south would have run headlong into fresh Soviet armies that Fremdherost had failed to count, which meant Manstein was proposing to win a race against reserves whose existence he had underestimated. Second, the northern pincer had already failed. Citadel was designed as a double envelopment, and a single pincer driving alone into a 300-kilometer defensive system, with the opposite arm stalled and now under counterattack at Oral, does not produce an encirclement. It produces a salient of its own. Third, no operational breakthrough was ever actually in prospect. Tactical advances in the south were real, and Manstein's forces had penetrated multiple belts, but penetration is not breakthrough, and the belts kept going. Frieser's phrase for the thing Manstein claimed had been taken from him is the impossible victory. This is where the memoir problem, flagged near the start, resolves into something larger than one book. The German generals who wrote after 1945 constructed a consistent architecture in which the German army stood undefeated in the field and was beaten only by its own political leadership. Manstein at Kursk gives the purest expression of that architecture, and for 4 decades Western histories of the Eastern Front rested largely on those memoirs, because the Soviet archives stayed closed. When those archives opened after 1991, the story changed in both directions simultaneously. The Soviet inflation of German losses collapsed, and the German claim of a stolen victory collapsed alongside it. Here is the deepest problem with the way Kursk usually gets told. Almost every account treats the battle as Operation Citadel, and treats the end of Citadel as the end of the story. Operation Citadel lasted from the 5th of July to roughly the 16th of July. The Battle of Kursk lasted until the 23rd of August. David Glantz and Jonathan House, whose 1999 study ranked among the first to use Soviet archival material systematically, argue that what actually mattered about Kursk lies not in the German offensive at all, but in the 2 Soviet counteroffensives that followed it. Glantz and House also render Prokhorovka not as a clean set-piece collision but as a confused series of engagements and hasty attacks, and they demolish the notion that a differently run citadel could have delivered a German victory. Operation Kutuzov opened on the 12th of July against the Oral salient. Operation Rumiantsev opened on the 3rd of August against Belgorod and Kharkov. On the 5th of August, 1943, Oral and Belgorod were both liberated, and Moscow fired the first victory salute of the war for those 2 cities. On the 23rd of August, 1943, Kharkov was recaptured, and that date marks the conventional end of the Battle of Kursk. Kharkov is the city Manstein had retaken in March, in the backhand blow that created the salient in the first place. The battle ends where it began, with the same city changing hands in the opposite direction 5 months later. By autumn, German forces were falling back toward the Dnieper, and the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front passed to the Red Army and never returned. This is also why the loss ratios, correctly understood, cannot save the German case. Zetterling and Frankson's statistical analysis concludes that overall loss ratios ran roughly 3-1 in Germany's favor, and in the Prokhorovka fighting they find roughly 334 Soviet vehicles destroyed against at most 54 German. 3-1. The German army fought at Kursk with a 3-to-1 kill advantage and lost the campaign anyway. A 3-to-1 exchange rate never sufficed for one reason, and the clearest way to understand it is the way a manufacturing analyst would, as a question of regeneration rate rather than inventory. Soviet industry built roughly 76,827 tanks during the Second World War, while Germany built roughly 24,000, excluding self-propelled guns. The T-34 series alone passed 57,000 units. German Panzer IV production across the entire war totaled roughly 9,000. Lend-Lease added roughly 11,900 armored fighting vehicles to the Soviet inventory. One figure explains Kursk better than any other. In 1943, T-34 production peaked at roughly 15,800 units. In 1 year, the Soviet Union built more T-34s than Germany built tanks of every type combined. Set that against the battlefield. Rotmistrov lost somewhere between 235 and 340 vehicles in a morning at Prokhorovka, and at the 1943 T-34 production rate, Soviet industry replaced that entire loss in under a week. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps lost 17 vehicles permanently between the 12th and 23rd of July, an extraordinary performance by any tactical measure, and yet the German war economy could not comfortably absorb the campaign-wide total of 252 write-offs, plus 156 Panthers, plus the Ferdinands lost to mines. Any operations manager recognizes this failure mode, because the loss rate never kills the system. What kills the system is the ratio of loss rate to replacement rate. A business shedding customers at 3% while acquiring at 10% is growing, while a business shedding at 1% and acquiring at 0.3% is dying, and dying faster than the competitor with the uglier-looking loss number. The Wehrmacht at Kursk owned the superior loss rate and the fatal replacement rate. The Red Army owned the catastrophic loss rate and a factory system that made those catastrophes affordable. That is what a war of attrition actually means, and it explains why the tactical brilliance of the German army in July of 1943 purchased nothing whatsoever. This film is called Kursk, the largest tank battle ever fought, so the title deserves examination too. The Battle of Kursk as a whole is generally accepted as the largest tank battle in history and the largest single battle in the history of warfare, and that claim rests on the totals. More than 5,000 Soviet tanks, close to 3,000 German tanks and assault guns, and nearly 2 million Soviet troops facing 780,000 Germans. There is, however, a rival. The Battle of Brody, sometimes called Dubno, fought between the 23rd and 30th of June, 1941, pitted roughly 750 to 1,000 German tanks of the 1st Panzer Group against somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 Soviet tanks belonging to 5 or 6 mechanized corps. Roughly 2,648 Soviet tanks were lost there. David Glantz, speaking at the United States Army Heritage Center in 2007, said of Brody that this, in fact, is the biggest tank battle in the Second World War. The Dupuy Institute takes a more cautious line, concluding that Brody might exceed the southern Kursk attack depending on how the engagement gets defined, but probably does not. What actually matters here is a narrower and sharper distinction. The Battle of Kursk, taken as an entire operation across 2 fronts in 7 weeks, is the largest armored engagement ever fought, and that claim survives. What does not survive is the claim attached to a single morning. Prokhorovka was never the largest tank battle in history. Prokhorovka was an engagement of roughly 800 to 900 armored vehicles, in which a Soviet tank army attacked 294 German vehicles including 15 Tigers, drove into its own anti-tank ditch, and lost between 235 and 340 vehicles against German write-offs numbering somewhere between 0 and 5. Both things hold true at once. Kursk is the largest tank battle ever fought, and the moment everyone points to when they say so is the moment that has been most thoroughly falsified. It would be dishonest to present the revisionist case as settled, because it is not settled, and the disagreements among the revisionists themselves are instructive. Valery Zamulin, the Russian historian and former research director at Prokhorovka, both supports and complicates the revision. Zamulin's archival work confirms the catastrophic Soviet losses, confirms the 334 irrecoverable vehicles for the 12th through 16th of July, confirms roughly 340 on the 12th alone, and confirms the anti-tank ditch disaster in language harsher than most Western historians use. Zamulin nonetheless insists that the tank engagement formed only part of a wider battle at Prokhorovka, and he resists the conclusion that the day amounted to a complete German victory. Zamulin's position deserves to be taken seriously precisely because it comes from someone who has read more of the Soviet documentation than almost anyone alive, and who has no interest in flattering the German account. Then there is the argument over what the battle meant. Dennis Showalter, in Armour and Blood, argues that Kursk was the key turning point of the war, mattering even more than Stalingrad in its long-term implications. The formulation attributed to Glantz splits the question three ways. Moscow determined that Germany would not win the war. Stalingrad determined that Germany would lose it. Kursk determined how fast. Topol and others argue something different again, holding that the war had already been decided and that Kursk gets credited with more weight than it earned. Topol's work cuts in both directions, which is what makes it valuable. Topol demolishes the Soviet propaganda version of Prokhorovka, Topol demolishes the German memoir version of a stolen victory, and Topol argues on top of that against the inflated place the battle occupies in popular history. The strongest case that Citadel was doomed from the start rests on three things: Soviet foreknowledge of the plan, 300 kilometers of defense in depth, and an uncommitted step front that German intelligence never counted. The strongest case against that conclusion is the one honest observation the Manstein school has left behind. In the south, on the 13th of July, German forces were still advancing when the offensive got cancelled. Both propositions can be held at the same time, and the resolution lies in the distinction between tactical and operational reality. German forces were still advancing tactically. Operationally, they were advancing into more belts, with a failed northern pincer, uncounted enemy reserves in front of them, and a Soviet offensive already rolling into the rear of Model's Ninth Army. The dispute over Prokhorovka never ended with the archives. It moved into stone and into diplomacy, and it remains live. The Prokhorovka Memorial, the belfry known as the Zvonitsa, stands 59 meters tall, sculpted by Vyacheslav Klykov and dedicated on the 3rd of May, 1995, for the 50th anniversary. Four pylons represent the 4 years of the war. The structure is topped by a figure of the Virgin, and a bell rings every 20 minutes. The Museum Reserve, Prokhorovskoy Pole, was created by decree on the 26th of April, 1995. Prokhorovka carries the designation Third Field of Russian Military Glory, placing it alongside Kulikovo in 1380 and Borodino in 1812, and the third battlefield of Russia Museum opened in 2010. Russian state memory treats Prokhorovka as a sacred victory involving roughly 1,200 tanks, and it has consistently resisted Western revisionist casualty figures. That resistance turned into a public confrontation in 2019. On the 9th of July, 2019, the history editor of Die Welt, Sven Felix Kellerhoff, published an article whose title translates as "The Red Army's Victory That Was in Reality a Defeat," drawing on the research of Frieser and Wheatley. According to Topol, writing in the Journal of Slavic Military Studies, Kellerhoff wrote that the monument should actually be torn down immediately. After Russian outrage, that line got softened into a statement that there was no reason for a victory monument. The Russian Foreign Ministry responded publicly in 2020. One correction is worth making, since the error circulates constantly. The publication was Die Welt, not Bild, and not Die Zeit. Scholarly work continues in parallel. Wheatley published The Panzers of Prokhorovka in 2023, and Topol published Facts Against Fables in 2021. The argument has now narrowed to a point that captures the entire character of modern Kursk research. An unresolved dispute between Topol and Wheatley now concerns whether the live standard lost 0 tigers or 1 tiger on the 12th of July, 1943. The entire remaining argument runs between 0 tigers and 1 tiger. Rotmistrov claimed 70 of them. The Kursk region has featured in contemporary events in recent years. This film concerns 1943, and it stays there. Return to where this started. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps went into action at Prokhorovka on the 12th of July, 1943 with 294 operational tanks and assault guns, 15 of them Tigers, 4 of those sitting in the sector that mattered, and no Panthers or Ferdinands at all. Facing them, the 5th Guards Tank Army attacked with roughly 500 to 616 vehicles drawn from a total of around 840, drove into an anti-tank ditch dug by its own side, and lost between 235 and 340 armored vehicles in a morning. German permanent write-offs that day fell somewhere between 0 and 5. Pavel Rotmistrov faced a commission led by Malenkov, and produced a claim of 400 German tanks including 70 Tigers, from a battle where 15 Tigers were present and 146 Tigers were committed to the entire campaign. That claim became the Soviet official history. The Soviet official history became the Western popular history. The Western popular history became the documentaries, the memorial, and the 1,500 tanks that never met on that field. While all of that was being constructed around a single morning in the South, the actual decision of the summer of 1943 was unfolding 400 kilometers north, where Operation Kutuzov opened against Orel on the very same day, threatening the rear of Model's 9th Army and forcing the cancellation of Citadel on the 13th of July. Operation Rumiantsev followed on the 3rd of August. Orel and Belgorod fell on the 5th of August. Kharkov fell on the 23rd of August, ending the battle in the same city where Manstein's backhand blow had begun it 5 months earlier. The Germans won the exchange rate at Kursk, roughly 3-1. Soviet factories built more T-34s in 1943 alone than Germany built tanks of every type. The tactical superiority of the Wehrmacht was real, measurable, and completely irrelevant. Prokhorovka ranks among the best documented engagements of the Second World War. The German quartermaster returns survived. The Soviet loss reports survived. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft photographed the field on the 14th, 15th, and 16th of July, 1943, and those photographs sit in the United States National Archives, where anyone can count the wrecks. Every piece of evidence needed to correct the record has existed for decades. The correction still has not fully arrived, because a general under-investigation needed a number, and because that number proved more useful to more people than the truth ever was. There is a monument at Prokhorovka 59 meters high, dedicated to a battle of 1,200 tanks that was fought by roughly 800. There are historians still arguing over whether the number of Tigers destroyed there was 0 or 1. Kursk was the largest tank battle ever fought, and that much is true. What lingers is the question of why the largest tank battle in history needed to be made larger, and who decided that it did.